Now, as they say in the UK, let's get cracking with the first module, which is Implement an Identity Management Solution. Quite a bunch in this, and you see it's 25 to 30% of the exam. So when you see a percentage that large, it's an area you want to spend some time. So categorically, there's 4 subsections. Implement initial configuration of Azure Active Directory, looking at roles, managing custom domains, device registration options, configuring delegation with administrative units, something that maybe you're not as familiar with, and configuring tenant-wide settings. And again, being specific with the word tenant here refers to an Azure Active Directory tenant or an instance of Azure Active Directory. That's how I call it. Second big category is create, configure, and manage identities, where you are going to create, configure, and manage users and groups, and also licenses. And that's something that more people probably have some experience with if you've been doing this. Third general category is implement and manage external identities. So that kind of should ring some bells. Azure B2B or B2C, all the different things you can do, the way you can get the users in individually or in bulk, and configuring identity providers, whether it's social identity providers or SAML or WS-Fed. And again, if you have older school knowledge of identity synchronization and federation, that might be more familiar, but if not, it's an area worth looking at. And finally, implement and manage hybrid identity, where again, these are kind of core fundamental things, but it's really a lot that have to do with Azure Active Directory Connect and all the options that are there. So again, if you set that up and figure it up, you're probably going to be pretty good, but you may have only just done Azure Active Directory Sync, but you didn't do Password Hash Synchronization, or hopefully you did that. That's what we recommend. But maybe you didn't do Passthrough Authentication, PTO, or Seamless Sign-On, or maybe you don't use ADFS or never did. You need to know how to implement and manage that, because you can actually set it all up with Azure AD Connect. I spent first 4 years of my life at Microsoft doing ADFS, and now it's almost not even needed because you can just do it with this wizard. Azure Active Directory Connect Health, lots of cool things. If you're not using it, good real world stuff, you should, or recommend it to your customers. How to implement and manage that. And then finally, troubleshooting synchronization errors, which again, that's kind of one of those day-to-day job type things, which is really handy and useful to know. Azure Active Directory roles. In Azure Active Directory, if another administrator or non-administrator needs to manage Azure Active Directory resources, you assign them the Azure Active Directory role that provides the permissions they need. For example, you can assign roles to allow adding or changing users, resetting user passwords, managing user licenses, or managing domain names. There's many built-in roles that can be leveraged, and hopefully you know those. To me, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. You should know, but if not, study it. Many built-in roles that you can see on the link provided. Additionally, there are custom roles that can be created. Those categories to review in the Azure AD docs include also app registration permissions, enterprise app permissions, and app consent permissions. Also in the Active Directory roles documentation, there are limits to how many different types of objects can be created. As an example, only 30 custom roles can be created within one Azure Active Directory tenant. And again, that's not per subscription, because you can have multiple subscriptions, but per Azure Active Directory tenant. Azure Active Directory PowerShell is another option to look at, which has 2 module options related to this topic, one for Azure Active Directory Graph and another for MS Online. MS Online is the older, and the recommendation is now to use the newer Graph commandlet. So you probably don't want to spend a lot of time on MS Online, but know that it is an option. It also would be worth reviewing some examples of commands with the Graph to see how they're composed for both user and group commandlets. A domain name is an important part of the identifier for many Azure Active Directory resources. It's part of a username or email address for a user, part of the address for a group, and is sometimes part of the app ID URI for an application. A resource in Azure Active Directory can include a domain name that's owned by the organization that contains the resource, and only a global administrator can manage domains in Azure Active Directory. You can add up to 5,000 managed domain names. If you're configuring all your domains for federation with on-premises Active Directory, you can add up to 2,500 domain names in each organization. When an organization is created, initial domain names such as contoso.onmicrosoft.com is also the primary domain name. The primary domain name is the default name for each new user that you create. Setting a primary domain or changing it streamlines the process for administrators to create new users in the portal. Therefore, many organizations will want to create a custom domain name, make it primary, verify it, and then use that. So instead of logging on with mark@contoso.onmicrosoft.com, I want to log on as mark@contoso.com with that custom domain name. When subdomains are added to the root domain created, you have to promote that, as we mentioned, and you can actually do that using Microsoft Graph, so you can set the authentication type to your desired type. Azure Active Directory provides a central place to manage device identities. The All Devices page, as you're seeing here, enables you to identify devices, including devices that have been joined or registered in Azure Active Directory, devices deployed using Windows Autopilot, printers using Universal Print. You also can perform device identity management tasks like enable, disable, delete, or manage objects. Printers and Windows Autopilot devices have limited management options in Azure Active Directory. They must be managed from their respective admin interfaces. To manage device identities using the Azure Active Directory portals, those devices must either be registered or joined to Azure Active Directory, and you must be assigned to one of the following roles to view or manage device settings in the Azure portal. And those roles are Global Administrator, Cloud Device Administrator, Global Reader, or Directory Reader. As an administrator, you can control the process of registering and joining devices by configuring the device settings in the same link that's provided for you. For more granular administrative control in Azure Active Directory, you can assign users to an Azure Active Directory role with a scope that's limited to one or more administrative units. You can add an administrative unit by using the Azure Portal, PowerShell, or Graph API. In Azure Active Directory, you can also remove an administrative unit that you no longer need as a unit of scope for administrative roles. And again, you can do it through either the portal, PowerShell, or Graph API. And Azure AD Tenant provides identity and access management capabilities to both applications and resources used by your organization. An identity is a directory object that can be authenticated and authorized for access to a resource. Identity objects exist for human identities such as students and teachers, and non-human identities like classroom and student devices, applications, and service principals. The Azure Active Directory tenant is an identity security boundary that is under the control of your organization's IT department. Within this security boundary, administration of objects such as user objects and configuration of tenant-wide settings are controlled by your IT administrators. Policies and settings in Azure Active Directory impact resources in the Azure AD Tenant through targeted or tenant-wide configurations. Administration includes the management of identity objects and scoped implementation of tenant-wide configurations. Objects include users, groups, and devices, and service principals. And you can scope the effects of tenant-wide configurations for authentication, authorization, self-serve options, and so on. Make sure you check out the link, and also there's a video, as you notice in the corner. You can add new users or delete existing users from Azure Active Directory. To add or delete users, you must be a user administrator or global administrator. You can also invite new guest users to collaborate with your organization by selecting Invite User from the New User page. If the external collaboration settings are configured to invite guests, the user will be emailed an invitation they must accept in order to begin collaborating. Such guests are known as B2B collaboration users. There also may be scenarios in which you want to manually create consumer accounts in an Azure Active Directory B2C directory. And note, that is separate and distinct from a regular Azure AD tenant. In contrast, when you are doing Azure B2B, it's my tenant versus your tenant. But if I had Azure B2C users that I was going to have within my subscription, I would have both an Azure Active Directory tenant as well as an Azure B2C tenant. There's far more information available in a user's profile than what you're able to add during the user creation. All this additional information is optional and can be added as needed by your organization. As an administrator, you can reset a user's password if the password's forgotten, if a user gets locked out of a device, or if the user never received a password. Note that when using Azure Active Directory, a temporary password is auto-generated for the user, but when using Active Directory on premises, you create the password for a user. In Azure Active Directory, if one of your users needs permissions to manage Azure Active Directory resources, you must assign them to a role that provides the permissions they need. A common way to assign Azure Active Directory roles to a user is on the Assigned Roles page for a user. You can also configure the user eligibility to be elevated just in time into a role by using Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. You can create a basic group using the Azure AD portal. There are several groups and membership types. Know the differences between security groups and Microsoft 365 groups. Also know the differences between membership types: assigned, dynamic user, and dynamic device. Azure Active Directory lets you use groups to manage access to your cloud-based apps, on-premises apps, and your resources. These resources can be part of the Azure AD organization, such as permissions to manage objects through roles in Azure AD, or external to the organization, such as software as a service or SaaS apps, Azure services, SharePoint sites, and on-premises resources. Many Azure Active Directory services require you to license each of your users or groups and associated members for that service. Only users with active licenses will be able to access and use the licensed Azure AD services for which that's true. Licenses are applied per Azure AD Tenant and do not transfer to other Azure Active Directory tenants. There are several license plans available for Azure AD services, including the Azure Active Directory Free, Premium P1, and Premium P2. Make sure you review the docs to understand what you get as you move from each license. Azure Active Directory now includes group-based licensing. You can assign one or more product licenses to a group. Azure AD ensures that the licenses are assigned to all members of the group. Any new members who join the group are assigned the appropriate licenses. When they leave the group, those licenses are likewise removed. This licensing management eliminates the need for automating license management via PowerShell to reflect changes in the organization and departmental structure on a per-user basis. By default, all users and guests in your directory can invite guests even if they're not assigned to an admin role. External collaboration settings let you turn guest invitations on or off for different types of users in your organization. You can also delegate invitations to individual users by assigning roles that allow them to invite guests. Azure Active Directory allows you to restrict what external guest users can see in your Azure Active Directory tenant. By default, guest users are set to a limited permission level that blocks them from enumerating users, groups, or other directory resources, but lets them see memberships of non-hidden groups. A new preview setting lets you restrict guest access with even further so that guests can only view their own profile information. With Azure AD B2B collaboration, a tenant administrator can set the following invitation policies. 1. Turn off invitations. 2. Only admins and users in the guest inviter role can invite. 3. Admins, the guest inviter role, and members can invite. And 4. All users, including guests, can invite. By default, all users, including guests, as we mentioned, can invite guest users. There are many ways you can invite external partners to apps and services with Azure Active Directory B2B collaboration. One method is to add guest users directly in the Azure Active Directory admin portal. You can also use PowerShell to add guest users, either one at a time or in bulk. Explore these links for related articles to review how to invite external users individually or in bulk using either the Azure portal or PowerShell. These quick starts and tutorials will walk you through the steps while preparing you for the exam as well. Azure Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, allows better security management for large organizations and for small and medium-sized businesses working with external collaborators, vendors, or freelancers that need access to specific Azure resources, but not necessarily to the entire infrastructure or any billing-related scopes. You can use the capabilities of Azure Active Directory B2B to collaborate with external guest users, and you can use RBAC to grant the permissions that guest users need in your environment. Native members of a directory or member users have different permissions than users invited from another directory as a B2B collaboration guest. For example, member users can read almost all directory information, while guest users have restricted directory permissions. Azure Active Directory is enabled by default for self-service sign-up, so users always have the option of signing up using an Azure AD account. However, you can enable other identity providers, including social identity providers like Google or Facebook. To set up social identity providers in your Azure AD Tenant, you'll create an application at the identity provider and configure credentials. You'll obtain a client or app ID and a client or app secret, which you can then add to your Azure Active Directory tenant. In addition to Azure AD accounts, external identities offer a variety of identity providers such as Microsoft accounts, which is in preview, email one-time password, which is in preview, Google, Facebook, or direct federation with any external identity provider that supports SAML or WS-Fed protocols. Note that direct federation identity providers cannot be used in your self-service sign-up user flows. Before you install Azure AD Connect, there are a few things that you need. You need an Azure Active Directory tenant. You need to add and verify the domain you plan to use in Azure AD. For example, if you plan to use contoso.com for your users, make sure this domain has been verified and you're not only using the contoso.onmicrosoft.com default domain. An Azure AD tenant allows by default 50,000 objects. When you verify your domain, the limit increases to 300,000 objects. If you need even more objects in your Azure Directory tenant, open a support case to have the limit increased. If you need more than 500,000 objects, you'll need a license such as Microsoft 365, Azure AD Premium, or the EMS Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. Azure AD Connect has two installation types for new installations, Express and Customize. Azure AD Connect Express settings is used when you have a single forest topology and password hash synchronization for authentication, and is typically used about 90% of the time by most organizations. So make sure you review the assumptions for using this option in the link provided. The customization path allows many more options than Express. Some examples of when to use this are when you do not have access to an enterprise admin account in Active Directory, you have more than one forest, or you plan to synchronize more than one forest in the future, you have domains in your forest not reachable from the Connect server, you plan to use federation or pass-through authentication for user sign-in, if you have more than 100,000 objects or need to use a full SQL server, or if you plan to use group-based filtering and not only domain or OU-based filtering. Make sure you also review the links on device and group right back. The Active Directory domain service stores passwords in the form of hash value representation of the actual user password. A hash value is a result of a one-way mathematical function, which is the hashing algorithm. There is no method to revert the result of a one-way function to the plain text version of a password. To synchronize your password, Azure Active Directory Connect Sync extracts your password hash from the on-premises Active Directory instance. Extra security processing is applied to the password hash before it is synchronized to the Azure Active Directory Authentication service. Passwords are synchronized on a per-user basis and in chronological order. The first time you enable the Password Hash Synchronization feature, it performs an initial synchronization of the passwords of all in-scope users. You cannot explicitly define a subset of user passwords that you want to synchronize. However, if there are multiple connectors, it is possible to disable password hash sync for some connectors, but not others, using the set-ADSync AAD password sync configuration commandlet. If you'd like to have a subset of users excluded from synchronizing their password hash to Azure AD, you can configure selective password hash synchronization. Azure Active Directory Passthrough Authentication allows your users to sign in to both on-premises and cloud-based applications by using the same passwords. Passthrough Authentication signs users in by validating their passwords directly against on-premises Active Directory. If you plan to deploy Passthrough Authentication in a production environment, you should install additional standalone authentication agents. Install these authentication agents on servers other than the one running Azure AD Connect. Azure Active Directory Seamless Single Sign-On automatically signs in users when they are on their corporate desktops that are connected to your corporate network. Seamless SSO provides users with easy access to cloud-based applications without needing any additional on-premises components. In addition to setting this up, you will need to enable an intranet zone policy called Allow Updates to Status Bar via script through group policy. This will add URL https://autologon.microsoftazuread-sso.com to all or selected users' intranet zone settings by using group policy. You can perform various ADFS-related tasks in Azure AD Connect with minimal user intervention by using the Azure AD Connect wizard. After you've finished installing the Azure AD Connect by running the wizard, you can run the wizard again to perform additional tasks. You can use Azure AD Connect to check the current health of the ADFS and Azure AD Trust and take appropriate actions to repair the trust. As you see in the graphic, you can also deploy additional ADFS servers, web application servers, or verify the ADFS login. Azure AD Connect can manage and report on ADFS, Azure AD Connect Sync, and even Active Directory domain services. Additionally, you can enable email notifications, remove servers from being monitored, and even manage access with role-based access controls or RBAC. Azure AD Connect Health supports managing access at 2 levels. 1, all service instances. This is recommended in most cases. Or 2, service instance. In some cases, you might need to segregate access based on the role types or by a service instance. In this case, you can manage access at the service instance level. There are different types of synchronization errors that can occur during the export operation to Azure Active Directory using the Azure AD connector. This connector can be identified by the name format being contoso.onmicrosoft.com. Errors during export to Azure AD indicate that the operation, whether it's an add, update, or delete, attempted by Azure AD Connect on Azure Active Directory failed. There are many options on this error link, so be sure to review topics like data mismatch errors, duplicate attribute failures, and so on.